Now that we've talked about chemoreceptors and their function in regard to vomiting, let's talk about something a little bit more pleasant, which is respiration or breathing. So when we talk about respiration, we could actually be talking about a couple of different things. So cellular respiration or aerobic cellular respiration is what we call it when a cell takes in oxygen and glucose and uses its mitochondria, right, the powerhouse of the cell, to make ATP. So those are the two raw ingredients that are going to go into this process for which the cell, primarily the mitochondria, can make ATP. Now, as a result of this process, carbon dioxide is produced as a waste product. So because of how our cells produce ATP, this is the predominant mechanism that they use, this cellular respiration, we as whole organisms need to bring oxygen into our bodies because it's one of the ingredients needed, and we need to get carbon dioxide out of our body because we're constantly producing it as a waste product. It's toxic if it builds up. So when we talk about respiration, we're talking about bringing oxygen in and sending carbon dioxide out of the body. So everything that you learned about in the respiratory system is all about oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. And the whole reason that we have to breathe is for those mitochondria, right? Is for making ATP via the process of aerobic cellular respiration. That's the whole reason. Okay. So when it comes to chemoreceptors for respiration, it makes sense then that some of the things we might be measuring would be oxygen and carbon dioxide, right? We want oxygen levels to be high enough and we don't want carbon dioxide levels to get too high. But interestingly, we can also use pH. So pH, of course, is a measure of how acidic or basic something is. And carbon dioxide, when it combines with the water in the plasma of our bloodstream, forms carbonic acid. So carbon dioxide is acidic. So the more carbon dioxide we have in our blood, the more acidic or lower in pH, because acids, remember, have lower pH less than 7, the more acidic our blood will be. So we can also use pH as kind of a proxy measure for carbon dioxide. So those are the three things that chemoreceptors used for the respiratory system are going to be potentially measuring. So we do have some chemoreceptors in the brain. So we're going to call those central chemoreceptors because they're located in the central nervous system, and they are in the medulla. So love me that medulla oblongata, and those receptors can sense carbon dioxide and pH. So they're right there in the medulla. They're going to be giving information to other parts of the medulla about what's going on in terms of carbon dioxide and pH levels. And it turns out that carbon dioxide and pH is a pretty good proxy most of the time for how effectively we are getting oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. So most of the time that works just great. If you have certain types of lung diseases, then you want information about oxygen as well. But most of the time, as long as you're getting the carbon dioxide out, you are also going to be getting enough oxygen in. We also have peripheral chemoreceptors, however. So these are not in the central nervous system, they're out in the periphery, and they're located in one of two main places, the aortic bodies and the carotid bodies. So these are in, obviously, large blood vessels. So you've got some in the aortic bodies here, and then you have the carotid bodies, which are located just next to, adjacent to the carotid arteries. So these are the big main arteries that are bringing blood to your whole body and specifically to your brain. So we care a lot about the oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH of these areas. And these chemoreceptors can sense all three. So the central ones didn't sense oxygen levels, but these do. And they're going to send signals up to the medulla. Since they're not located there, now we're going to have to send sensory axons up to the medulla, and those axons are going to travel through nerves, in this case, through cranial nerves. So for the carotid bodies, those sensory axons carrying that chemoreceptor signal are going to travel through the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is cranial nerve number 9. And the ones from the aortic body are traveling up through the vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10. These are new functions that you didn't learn about for those nerves before because it was just like we hadn't learned about this yet. So Let's put it all in perspective and integrate what we know. So cranial nerve number 9, glossopharyngeal, right? Glosso means tongue, pharynx means throat. So it's a mixed nerve. Its motor function is muscles for swallowing, and its sensory that we learned about previously is taste from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. Remember, anterior 1/3 of the tongue is facial nerve. Took me a minute. And then now we're also going to add chemoreceptors from the carotid bodies. Now, cranial nerve number 10, vagus, does have motor signals. We haven't talked about those yet. We will get to those. But in terms of sensory, we learned in 14A that it's bringing in sensory information from the intestines, from the entire gastrointestinal tract. And then now we're also going to add that it's bringing in chemoreceptors from these aortic bodies. And then I just remembered that we also learned that it brings in taste. This is really hard. It doesn't give me a text option. Taste from the pharynx. So we learned about that in the taste lecture. So my bad that I forgot to include it here. So now we're learning lots of things about these two cranial nerves. Coming back to those peripheral chemoreceptors, so they are going to send their signals then, as we just discussed, via the vagus nerve in the case of the aortic bodies, the glossopharyngeal nerve in the case of the carotid bodies, up to the medulla. So the central ones, again, are just going to measure CO2 and pH levels, but the peripheral ones have the added ability to sense CO2. This is all of that in summary, right? So respiration is all about bringing in oxygen, getting rid of carbon dioxide because of what our cells are doing to produce ATP. Carbon dioxide is acidic, so when it builds up, our blood becomes more acidic and the pH goes down. So pH can be a really good proxy for CO2 levels. Those central chemoreceptors are already in the medulla. They sense CO2 and pH levels. The peripheral ones can sense those two as well as oxygen, and they're going to send their signals up through to the medulla through different nerves. So the ones from the aorta, the aortic bodies, are going to send signals via cranial nerve number 10, the vagus, and the carotid body ones are going to send their signals through cranial nerve number 9, glossopharyngeal. All right, next we'll talk about the whole respiratory control center business now that we know how we're getting our sensory information.